A producer's role is as diverse as it is difficult. Join us as we sit with some of the most accomplished producers of the year to talk about the money, the egos, and the art involved in some of the year's best films. We'll sit with Peter Chernin, Exodus and Planet of the Apes, Eric Fellner, The Theory of Everything, John Lesher, Birdman and Fury, Marc Platt, Into the Woods, Cathleen Sutherland, Boyhood, and Emma Thomas, Interstellar. Welcome to the Hollywood Reporter Roundtables, the producers. Welcome to the Hollywood Reporter Roundtables, the producers. I'd like to introduce Emma Thomas, Marc Platt, Eric Fellner, Peter Chernin, Cathleen Sutherland, and John Lesher. Thank you for being here. Let's start with a simple question. Toughest decision you've had to make? What is it? Peter, you first.
How many hours do we have? I got a lot of them.
For you?
I would say that's relevant. The toughest decision I had to make was sort of what did I do as Titanic went ultimately $110 million over budget at a time when $110 million, which was the green light price, was probably the most expensive movie ever made. And, you know, it was sort of surreal because, you know, everything that could go wrong was going wrong. You know, I was sort of dead man walking in Hollywood. Everyone said, that guy's getting fired, you know. And on the other hand, everything about the movie I thought was great. The dailies were great. We had seen an hour of footage was great. And so you tried to decide what to do. And ultimately, you know, the only decision I ever really made there was to say, keep going. That our only hope of coming out alive was to make a great movie. So, you know, we tried to do some rationality, but we never cut back a penny on the quality of the movie. And it was sort of double down the bet at that point.
Did you have conversations with Rupert Murdoch about that?
I had conversations. You know, the one thing that in retrospect, I did was smart is Rupert at that point was living in LA and his office was across the hall from me. And I'd get a piece of bad news and I would run into his office and tell him bad news as quickly as I could. You know, I just sort of...
He must have loved seeing you.
Right? But, you know, I think...
How did he handle that?
He was great. You know, first of all, he would have fired me if the movie hadn't worked. And
yeah.
I'm not sure I would have blamed him.
Mm-hmm.
But in the process, he was basically, put your head down, do the best. You know, I'd sort of say, this is what happened, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're doing it. And he said, go for it. But it was a great lesson in the sense of trust your gut, because I ultimately really believed in the movie.
But at one point, you or the studio didn't, because you did a deal with Paramount.
We did a deal with Paramount.
And the deal was that they would buy half the movie with a cap.
Yeah, we did a deal with Paramount before we started shooting. So all of those overages were ours.
Was that a mistake?
Sure, it was a mistake. But look, you know, the truth is financing on any successful movie is a mistake. You'd be better off financing 100% of any successful movie. So by definition, you finance movies to try and manage risk on some level. But if you were doing it after the fact, you would never take a penny of financing in any movie that's successful. And you would take 100% financing in any movie that failed. But you don't have that luxury in advance. But we made that decision before we started shooting. It was because at that point it was the most, before we went $100 million over budget, it was the most expensive movie ever made. So it was hard.
Did you get anxious about that, or do you let go that easily?
Sure, I was anxious, but you know, it's funny, I always used to tell my kids that someday I'm going to be fired. And they're like, And I sort of always assumed that I'd be fired one day, and I think it's the only way to do those jobs. I think you got to be in those jobs sort of betting your gut. I think you got to be in any of these jobs. You got to bet your gut and go for it.
Because otherwise you're lost.
Because first of all, if you're going to get fired, you may as well get fired on your own terms.
Have you ever been fired?
I actually have not. I'm getting ready to fire myself soon.
John, have you been fired, and how do you handle that?
I was fired, yeah, trusting my gut. It's hard, but you get up and it makes you refocused on what matters to you and why we all got into the business, which is to, for me, was always about making movies I want to see. So as Peter said, you always go into those jobs knowing that day someday will happen. In fact, Brad Gray would tell me all the time, you know, someday you're going to get fired. And I actually look at it as a glorious achievement. You have to either decide, I care about the films that we're making, or I really want to stay in this job for a really long time. And I was always very interested in making the movies that I wanted to make.
I think the interesting thing about this town too is that like being fired isn't necessarily
A big deal.
deal. It's not a bad thing, and oftentimes people are fired right when things are going great.
Yeah, I mean, I felt bad about it at the time, but it put me back on the path I think it's better for me to be on, actually, which is what I'm doing now. So,
And why is that better?
it's just, for me, I think plays to my strengths better. You know, I'm much better being on the side of a filmmaker and making a good movie than being the greatest corporate executive of all time. I mean, that's just, I don't think that plays into my strengths.
What makes somebody a great corporate executive?
The people that I admire in the film business, they want to make movies that maybe on paper don't always seem like the, you know, why, but they're movies that you want to see. As opposed to just managing, you know, quarterly earnings and trying to hit numbers, and that's really what you're working on when you're at a studio, is really managing all sorts of different things.
Mark, you had this extraordinary shift.
John, because I've been fired twice as a studio head.
From TriStar?
TriStar and then
Universal,
Universal, where I ended up staying and have been for almost 20 years now, or for many, many years. So, and for me, I loved being an executive, and it taught me a lot and allowed me to develop relationships and really understand how to navigate the corporate structure. Where I started out in the business was to be a producer, to be a storyteller.
Yeah.
That's the thing that makes me the happiest, is being part of a creative process, either being the creator or facilitating.
Yes, I didn't grow up in the studio business, so I was an agent for a really long time. So just mining the politics of a studio did not come particularly naturally to me.
Right.
Like, that's just not.
And you always had great clients, by the way.
Thank you.
When you were an agent. But I started a company called Orion, which was a fantastic company. You guys met. Orion Classics did some of your early films. And that was a company that the philosophy of which was filmmakers. It was all about our assets are our filmmakers. And I was taught as an executive at a time where I guess it was luxurious to be taught that my job was to facilitate the vision of the filmmaker, to find an intelligent way to make the film, but to support it. And that's why Woody Allen and Dennis Hopper and John Schlesinger and Jonathan Demme and all these wonderful filmmakers made their films for years at Orion, because that was the philosophy of that company. And what happened through time as the film companies became vertically integrated into larger corporations, then the agendas started to compete. And as a studio head, I found that my presence in the creative process started to diminish the higher up I went, and my contributions were almost in sound bites. Yes, we decided what films to make and married which director and which writer, but there were so many other agendas to attend to in terms of the corporations that began to own and have other agendas that it ultimately made me unhappy.
China in particular is becoming such an important market. Could you today make the decision to ignore China if you're developing a film?
I think the odds are better than not that Exodus doesn't get released in China.
Yeah.
Why?
We don't know yet.
Well,
I think just sensitivity about religious movie or movie with a religious background. So,
and also, the market isn't at a point yet where you can actually go, you know, we know we're going to be able to generate X revenue from this, because you may not get a release, you may not get a slot, you may not.
Yeah,
so
I think
it's fool's gold. It's got to be icing, not the cake.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think
What
mostly
China
you make your decision to make the movie without taking into account what it's going to do in China.
I completely agree. I mean, it's interesting. Over the years, we find that in all of our conversations in a marketing sense, we spend more and more time talking about China, and there's less and less certainty, frankly, about whether or not we're ever going to get released there. I mean, some of our films have been released there and done very well, and some haven't at all. And ultimately, I think you're completely right, Eric, at this point in time, where there's no certainty whatsoever about, you know, whether you even get a release date, let alone sort of, you know, they might pull your movie 2 weeks into your run, you know, for all sorts of reasons that don't have anything to do with you or your film. And I just think you have to go in, you know, focusing on what you know. And
which films have not been released there and why?
Inception was released there, and that was very successful. The Dark Knight was not released there. And it was not released there. My memory is that there were some sensitive story issues that we knew were going to get cut out. And it wasn't something that we wanted to do. We didn't want to put out a film that had been cut to shreds. You have no control. It's not like you make the cuts, they make the cuts.
Which story issues in particular?
Oh, we had a piece of the story set in Hong Kong.
And that alone?
Yes. And so we knew that would probably come out.
The only film that we made that could have been a huge hit in China was Johnny English, because they love Rowan Atkinson. But we stupidly set the story in Hong Kong, and it wasn't very pro-China, and so it never got a release there. So, you have to be very careful on an editorial level before you can guarantee.
Has Boyhood been released in China?
I believe so. We did actually get banned in a couple of Middle Eastern countries because we weren't family-oriented enough.
Which countries?
Kuwait was one of them, and then a neighboring one. It just was too much teenage angst going on, or whatever was happening, a little too much language, a little too much, underage drinking and all of that, just not family-oriented enough. I mean, surprise, but...
What's really liberating about being a producer, having been an executive, is your first thought can just be, here's material, or here's a filmmaker, or here's a project. I want to invest my time and my creativity, and then you figure out the rest, which when you were running a studio, it's only one piece of a much larger equation. And I just find that...
I can't imagine that Into the Woods was an easy film to get financed.
It wasn't. When there's a challenging film like that, having been on the other side, what I say to the head of a studio, in this case Alan Horde, was, look, give me a box, if you will. Tell me the people that have to be in it and name the price, any price, that it becomes undeniable to you. I don't care how challenging it is. If you give me the box, I at least have the opportunity to try and deliver the box back. And we were able to deliver that. People nobody worked for very much money on it because people wanted to be in the film. Actors love to be in musicals, as you know, anyway. Also, I think Steve Sondheim was a great attraction, and Rob Marshall, who was, he and his partner John are producers on the film and started the project, and he's a magnet for actors too. So everybody cut their prices, cut the way we made the movie, and we did it in a contained way, and we did it in London and got the tax credit. And the other thing I did say was Into the Woods, by the way, has different fairy tale characters, and it's a contemporary spin, although it's classic fairy tales, and they're public domain characters. But what I did say to Alan Horn was, there's no way you want Cinderella and Jack and the Beanstalk and Little Red, even though they're public domain, to go to another studio, particularly a studio that has theme park. So I said, you need to keep that in your family, and I think that was also motivation.
Compelling.
And then they stood by it, and we're wonderful partners on it.
So what are the conversations when you have a film like Interstellar, where gross, including marketing, is roughly $250 million investment? You go in and you've got 3 different companies involved. What are the conversations? Are they begging to do it? Or are they saying, please, please, please bring this in under 100?
It was Paramount's project when we came onto it. And we've never had a deal at Warner Brothers, but we have, over the years had a great deal of loyalty to them. And if Chris had written a script and we'd gone out with it, it would have gone to Warner Brothers. There was a certain amount of loyalty there. And so when we became involved, we asked them, if Paramount, if it would be possible to share the project with Warner Brothers, and I think chances are they were probably going to be bringing a partner in anyway, and they very graciously agreed to do that. And we were on a pretty tight schedule, and so what we were saying to them was, look, we haven't done a budget yet. We know what we think this film should cost, and we gave them a number, and we said, this is going to be the worst case scenario. We're going to try and do it for less. And I don't know that Paramount would have done that, but luckily they had Warner Brothers saying, it's okay. They said that to us on Inception too, and they came in significantly under, and so they sort of took the punt. You
and Chris, you do come in under.
We try.
You try. Have you ever not?
Batman Begins, we were a little over, but honestly, I would say we're much better able to take risks, I think. We're able to say, no, we don't need that. With Batman Begins, everyone was like, well, it's a Batman film. It's action. It's this, that, and the other. And you have to have this. And now we're like, no, you don't, And we very much approach our films, even though they are big movies and they have a lot of scale, we approach them as far as possible as sort of smaller films, and we try to do away with, the
So you're in an
bells and
unusual
whistles.
situation with working with your husband.
Yes.
You're his producer.
Yes.
I'm assuming he gets final cut. What do you disagree with? And at what point can you push and say, no, you're not getting this?
I don't think I ever say, no, you absolutely can't have that, because he's Chris Nolan and I'd be crazy to, he has a very clear vision, and I would be crazy to say, you absolutely can't have that. Now, that's not to say that we don't have conversations about, what I think.
Was there anything you disagreed on?
Oh, we disagree all the time.
Such
I mean,
as?
constantly.
Lunchtime.
Oh,
dinner
gosh,
time
absolutely.
For the
What's
kids.
for breakfast?
But for instance, the script. Did
But
you
I
say,
think-
did you say, I think the script should go in a certain direction, it's not, or?
I have notes. I mean, he knew exactly what it wanted to be, and I loved what he was sort of pitching.
Control or telling them what to do. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. It isn't really that real. Of course you have opinions, and of course you have to have ways of disseminating them, and of course you have to say if you think maybe they're making a mistake. But ultimately, our job is to make it happen and be as brilliant as it can be. Trust them, because that's why you're working with them, and then do all the other stuff that they don't want to do, which is the marketing, the distribution, the financing, all of that stuff around. I think a lot of producers maybe focus up sometimes too much on set and not enough on all the other stuff. If you've hired the right director and you've got a genius working for you, support them, support their vision. And that's, I imagine, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, but I imagine that's how it works.
Have you ever had a film like Titanic that's sort of gone horribly
Many.
wrong? Give one example, and how you handle that.
In 100 films, I don't think, Tim and I, there's been one film that had problems, and that was beyond our control.
And the problems were what?
Just stuff.
Thank you for telling us so much. Kathleen, you had the opposite situation from Interstellar. You had very little money, and you're
True.
going in not knowing how long this is going to take.
True.
Tell us about how you get Boyhood off the ground and what those conversations are.
The commitment was there from IFC, which was, super great, but it wasn't a huge amount of money. We had a $200,000 budget every year that never increased. That was, I think, for us, from a production standpoint, like our biggest challenge was, just keeping that
You made that
going.
film over, what, 12 years?
12 years, yeah.
What was the biggest surprise in that whole process?
Finishing? Actually, it's funny. It was kind of a surprise. When we finished, we kind of looked up and went, oh my gosh, we're done? This is going to be
Did
it.
you
This is
edit
our
it
last
as you
round.
went along, or
Yeah,
did you? Okay.
it was edited. Sandra Adair was the editor on it, and it was being edited. So you had this really, unique way of making a project, because he did an edit every year, and then he would occasionally go back and just look at the overall of where it was so far and do another re-edit. And so that process, he had a lot of time in between, like that luxury of time of being able to think about it, as we went along. From a production standpoint, it's not like you're handed one script and said, okay, let's line this out and let's get this done and we're gonna go in. It was sort of like, hey, next year, what's the scenario gonna be? And everything was in Rick's head.
Were there set times every 2 years to shoot?
That was just another scheduling, issue, another unique thing, which was, trying to get everybody to come together.
Patricia's on a show.
Patricia was on Medium. Rick had other films in between. Ethan was going off and doing tons of projects in theater and all of this. The kids were the easiest thing, because they were just kids and they were growing up, and they didn't have much going on. So it was like, hey, we're going to do this. But it was just getting all of those little, like Tetris, just getting all of those little boxes to just come together.
What are
at
the
one
moral
time.
imperatives do you think could really affect a kid's life? Did you think about that and talk about it?
About Eller and Lorelai. Lorelai was sort of used to the business.
Because she's Rick
because she's
Linklater's
Richard
daughter.
Linklater's daughter, and she's traveled and, been around it all. But, Eller was just so young, and his parents are, they're artists. The thing about Eller was, that was one of the things that I really thought about a lot, was, that as we got further into this
Eller
process.
plays the central character.
He plays the central character, and, just letting him be a kid. He came to work for 1 or 2 weeks a year, and then he went back to his life. And in some way, a lot of reporters had asked, like, well, how was Eller affecting the film? And I started thinking about it. I was like, well, how are we affecting Eller? Like, how did being in the film and being around us and sort of in that environment and then going back to his real life, how was that forming him as he grew up? And we created like pretty much a family environment. It was the same people coming back year after year.
It feels that way when you watch the film.
Exactly.
It feels that way.
Yeah, and and it was kind of like summer camp for everyone. That we all got together and we got to do another round of it. And crew always wanted to come back.
How many, like small crew, right?
Yeah, we had a small crew. Probably our lunch counts were 45 a day.
Like on Titanic.
Yeah, like on Titanic. I mean, we obviously had a huge CG department. I mean, as you can see, but
You've really had no experience with the studio world. Does it appeal to you or not?
Wow, does it appeal to me? Yeah, that's no.
With Birdman, what was the toughest decision?
Very tough decisions. It was like everything about it was like, let's do it in the hardest way. It's like no one wanted us to cast Michael Keaton, who we absolutely thought was the only person that we could make the movie with. He just had the authority and the ability to navigate between comedy and drama in a very unique way. And then fortunately, we cast a great ensemble around it to kind of justify this bold creative decision, and then we shot it in this crazy way where,
which is effectively all one take.
Yeah, and so when we would go into meetings with people, we would talk about the film and all this stuff, and then it'd be like, well, who do you want to put in? It's like, well, we're gonna have this great ensemble, and we got Michael Keaton, and then we would maybe sometimes say we're gonna shoot it one shot, but sometimes we wouldn't even mention it. And then getting to shoot in a real Broadway theater on a very limited budget, we really made the bold decision of like, let's just go for it, because it wouldn't be the same if we did it anywhere else.
Peter, today, would you buy a studio? There has been talk that you're looking to buy one.
Would I buy a studio? Sure. I actually think the long-term economics of the studio business are pretty positive. I think the movie business is in some ways healthier than the television business right now.
Why is that?
I think the television business, fundamentally, there's too much product. There's just so much product being produced. With the exception of subscription video on demand, most of the back end is disappearing.
Right.
So I think that you're seeing the economics of the television business get squeezed. Right. And the movie business, I think you're seeing ongoing, continued growth internationally, and I think you're seeing digital growth. And so I think that there's pretty decent tailwinds for the movie business.
And yet it's sort of said that, return on investment is something like 7% a year for a studio.
If you look at studio economics as a whole, studio margins on average are probably about 7 or 8%. You have a couple of guys doing it at the 2% range. You have a couple of guys, probably Disney at the forefront right now. Historically, Warner's and Fox doing it in the sort of high teen range. It's obviously a really bad return on investment if you're putting a couple of $1 billion at risk and making 2% of your money, but you should manage it better in that case.
What's the biggest challenge facing the film business looking forward over the next few years?
I think the fundamental financials are pretty decent. The film business also has one huge advantage, which is that technology has tended to disaggregate products. So, the best example of that is technology disaggregated the album. And the music business made most of its money by, you wanted to buy one song and you had to go buy an album, there were 12 songs. The movie business doesn't have anything to be disaggregated. People don't want to watch one act, they want to watch the whole movie. And so that economic value is there. I think the industry's done a terrible job on marketing costs. Yeah. And I think that the industry needs to drastically improve the efficiency of its marketing.
How?
Well,
I think braver.
Being braver, I also think simplistically, there's an enormous amount of data available that wasn't available 5 or 10 years ago. Basically, most people are buying tickets online, most people are watching trailers online, most people are purchasing sort of electronic sell-through and DVD copies online. There's a core group. Core moviegoers in this country is about 30, 40 million people. You open a big movie, you open Interstellar, you're going to have, 90% awareness. 70% of those people are never going to the movies, and we've spent a lot of marketing money in getting to them. But I think fundamentally, the challenge in the business are what they always are, which is they are entirely creative. Entirely.
I think Steven Spielberg and George Lucas warned a year or so ago about spiraling costs and these massive investments in franchise-type movies, and at some point there's going to be an excess of them. Are the studios making the right decision following all these franchise films, Mark?
Well, in the moment they seem to be, because so many of them are working, and it becomes sort of part of the culture of filmgoer, like a television series. I want to see the next one, and then the next one, and the next one. And until that proves otherwise, and they're smart decisions if they're made intelligently, and if the quality of them is good. At the end of the day, if they're not good, there won't be a franchise. But you look at some of these franchises, and even taking Marvel aside, which sort of already had a built-in brand, look at something originally created like Fast and Furious at Universal. I mean, I don't see any end in sight. They're in 17 or 18, I don't know how many they've made, but if they keep making them good and delivering to an audience, then it seems like a smart business to be in.
Emma, would you go back into a franchise film?
If it was the right franchise film, I mean, I think that the difficulty is that everyone puts the franchise movies into one box and sort of treats them as if they're all the same thing. And I think that the future of franchises is studios sort of allowing them to be their own thing and not all trying to imitate each other and do exactly, because I think that's the true danger for the theatrical
We certainly
experience.
had that experience with Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes, which was sort of a loony concept we tried to do. And we didn't know whether it would work when we did the first one, but the studio gave us enormous latitude to sort of try and do a different kind of franchise movie. It's I think, reasonably thoughtful franchise movie. It's got issues involved, really hard to pull off. And
what was the hardest thing to pull off?
We spent the entire budget before we knew whether it would work. And what I mean by that is we had yet to see a shot of a CG photorealistic ape. And we had shot the entire movie, and we mostly edited the entire movie, down from 3 hours and 40 minutes to 2 hours and 10 minutes without seeing a single shot of an ape. Just all with guys in gray pajamas with dots on their faces. And it's actually fascinating. It's a wonderful movie to watch because Andy Serkis is so compelling. But we didn't know whether it would work. So by the time we did this movie, it was so much easier because we at least knew that the technology worked. But no one had ever sort of done photorealistic, sentient animals.
You've done such a variety of films. You've got St. Vincent, which is a low-budget, very independent film. You've got Exodus, which is not. Is the role of the producer the same on both films?
Sure. The role of the producer is to will these things into happening and then to protect them and to make them as good as you possibly can and to package them appropriately, get the script correct. And St. Vincent's took not that long, 2 years. Exodus took us 5 years from when it was first pitched to me. But it's no different than this excites me. It's what I said earlier about gut. They excited me or they moved me. St. Vincent moved me. Exodus I just thought was incredibly moving, emotional, heroic story.
The thing that I love about being a film producer is that ability that in that one moment, if I decide, or Tim and I decide to put all our attention onto something, we can make something happen. And at the end of the day, there will be something on screen all
that
around
wasn't
the world
there before.
that wasn't there before. And that is a kind of a gorgeous thing in a way. Just getting something up on its feet is a wonderful job.
You have a very strong partner, and you do a lot of films. How do you
know
define?
he's strong? Wrestled with him? Or?
Not saying you're weak. How do you divide the work?
Relationships. If it's a director or a writer or an idea that I've had, I'll do it. And vice versa with him.
Do audience previews help?
Well, they don't do them.
We don't. We do actually.
You have friends and family.
Yes, exactly. We don't do numbers. We don't do NRG screenings, but it's a massively important part of our process, screening the movie for an audience, and we make them write out cards because we want people to be honest about what they think about the film. But to us, really, the true value of sitting in a room with 200 people is sort of feeling where they're shifting in their seats and where they're,
But if that's
when they're going to the bathroom.
if it's family and friends, maybe they don't shift in quite the same way.
No, they do.
They do. And it's about numbers. Once you have more than 50 people in a room, frankly, once you have more than 10 people in a room, they become a sort of unit. There's something magical about that, and whether you know them or your editor knows them or what, it's
a collective
great.
experience. It's what makes movie going so great. But when an audience is riveted and leaning in, you feel it, and you know when.
What did you change?
Or when they're laughing, or when they're not.
What did you change in Interstellar based on that reaction?
Oh, I think it was mostly pacing issues. It's usually pacing.
Yeah, or if something isn't confusing to them, or
pacing. Sometimes tonally, there's a tonal shift somewhere you weren't aware of, but
We were even looking for a title, because in the beginning we really weren't sure what our title was going to be. It was hard to come.
Did you have different
come down.
titles along the way?
We were always called
One a
the
year.
Untitled 12-Year Project, which is funny because at the very end we're sitting around the kitchen table and we're all trying to come up with a name, the new title, and
12 years
and
a
we
kid.
we said 12 years, and we were like, yeah, 12 years, we could do 12 years, and I pulled out my iPhone and I was like, well, I don't know, there's some movie called 12 Years a Slave coming that's in production, so that took that away.
What else did you think of as titles?
We really wanted a word that sort of was like familyhood, that sort of encompassed the whole thing. But the film is shot from Mason's perspective, so we thought about something like It's Always Right Now, or something a little more ethereal like the character. But Boyhood just kept coming back, and I hope it's a good title.
It's a
I love
wonderful
it.
title. It tells
It
you
is.
everything you need to know.
Yeah.
Titles have a way of doing that often, where after the fact they become what
course.
the film is.
I know,
and
and-
you can't imagine it
Yeah,
without
I know
it.
now it's like
Wonderful title.
I wouldn't know what else to call it now. Didn't know what to call it before anyway, so.
When you were at Fox, how involved was Murdoch with the film side of things?
Not at all.
Oh, really?
We'd do an annual budget presentation to him. That was it. He was a great fan of movies that worked.
They all like the
Me
hats.
too.
But no, Rupert was a great boss. Rupert sort of let me do anything I wanted. He was incredibly supportive. He'll hold you accountable, but if you're performing, Rupert's the best.
What were the questions he asked you?
I don't know. I talked to him 5 times a day, so he'd ask me thousands of questions. Just trying to keep each other informed of what we were doing and make sure.
Do you still have a close relationship with him?
Yes.
Did he ever give you a piece of advice that you remember?
Generally, I've found in this life, most people don't sit you down and say, let me tell you what to do, sonny boy. You learn. I certainly learned an enormous amount from Rupert. I learned how to be bold more than anything. He's probably the boldest person I've ever met in my life. Fearless. And it was great.
What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given in terms of film?
I was Eric's assistant.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes. And
Really?
yes, when I moved to LA.
I like when you were just both putting on those English accents. Isn't that amazing? Was he a good boss?
He was a great boss. He was a great boss, and I have to say that my experience
Was she a
of
good
working
assistant?
She was brilliant, and we still miss her.
But I was at Working Title for, quite a long.
Yeah,
I think
long
I
time.
started in '93 and I left in 1999. And just the whole way they conducted the company and sort of picked material, I think was just very inspirational. And yes.
And what about you?
I made this film at Warner Brothers. Greg Silverman said right before we started shooting, he said, take some chances and be bold. And I was like, I love that, because they trusted us and we were going to be responsible, but at the same time, take some chances and be bold. I thought that was, I loved hearing that.
The funniest advice I ever got was when I took over the studio, and I didn't know what I was doing. And I'd come from the TV business, and everybody was like, oh, this TV idiot, et cetera. And Tom Mount, who had been a really big executive at Universal over the years, called me up, gave me great advice. He said, the key to whether or not you're going to be successful in this job is whether you get lucky with somebody else's movie in the first year. He said, because it's going to take 3 years for your own movies to be ready. You'll be just fine at it. If you don't get lucky with somebody else's movie, you'll get fired before you get there. And if you do, you'll have the time to get there. And it's actually great advice about running a studio, because it takes 3-4 years to put your stamp on it. And you get fired before you get a chance to if something lucky doesn't happen. But it was actually a sort of weird relief, because it made you go, okay. And then Home Alone 2 came out like 6 months later.
I heard it was your movie.
It was not my movie.
He spread the word.
Absolutely not my movie.
Is it possible to be bold today when there are computerized models? I mean, Fox, I know in particular, runs everything through a computer model.
I'm not sure that's as true as you think it is.
What do you mean?
No.
What do you mean?
Didn't you talked about this a couple of years ago?
Yeah.
You were discussing your computer
you were very
model.
fixated on this 2 years ago when we did this.
I'm
last time.
fixated
But I'm
with the same
intrigued to
thing.
hear.
But I'm amazed you remember from 2
mean,
years
well,
ago.
it's-
I think
when-
numbers are run, but it doesn't mean they're
They do
dispositive.
a comp analysis based on what films you can sort of compare it to, and then they kind of look at cross-section of films and try to make an analysis.
Yeah, I mean-
every studio will run a P&L.
Yeah.
But every business will run a P&L,
Yes.
and each
course.
film is a business.
And
so you
it's
have
not
to.
instructive of anything. It's certainly because you don't
It's
know.
a guess. It's a
guess. And I think the
prediction.
way
Well, it's a guide. I
the
think
way
it can
it should
tell
be
you.
used, it certainly shouldn't be used to try and predict what the movie's going to do, because who knows? What it should be used as is an odds-making tool, which is you sort of pick a number and say, okay, the movie breaks even at $80 million in U.S. box office. You run all these numbers to
What are the odds?
right?
Yeah.
Are the odds more than 50% that I'm going to do more than that, or less than 50%? As less, you go, it's probably too expensive.
And it's
we
a
should
gut,
nurse.
whether it's
a
gonna do
gut thing,
more or
but
less.
it's all just a tool to help you analyze odds.
And when you do an independent film, they do sales projections on what foreign sales will be. So you'll have this thing that you think is amazing and wonderful with a great cast, and they'll say, well, it's worth 11, and it's like, well, I need to make it for 15, and they're like, well, it's 11, that's all it's worth, and that I find one of the most challenging things is like trying to say, well, actually, if I make it great, it's actually worth more. If I make it for 11 and it's not any good, then you're throwing your money away.
Right.
So it's just trying to find that balance all the time.
I'm curious how we would have looked to you in your business model. How would we have done on your computer
What was your budget?
analysis? 2.4
Well, you just would have
production,
made it.
and then
If you
into
liked the script, you would have made it. You wouldn't have done a model at that level.
Yeah.
4.5. Even though it'd take you 12 years.
It's like Peter was saying, when you read something and you're emotionally engaged with it and it isn't too much of a stretch, you just do it. You find a way of doing it. That's what you did and we all do. You find a way of doing it. So
when I greenlit Titanic, the most expensive movie ever made, I remember having a conversation with Jim Cameron and basically said, either this movie's going to be a huge success because every guy in the world is going to say, Jim Cameron since Titanic, yeah. And every woman's going to say Romeo and Juliet on the Titanic, yeah. Or every woman's going to go, why do I want to watch some Jim Cameron action movie? And every guy's going to say, why do I want to watch some period love story? I said, it's going to be a big hitter, it's going to be a bomb, and we're not going to know until we make it, so let's go make it.
I couldn't sleep if I had to do that. Last question.
Why don't you
then
still run a studio? Go and buy a studio.
Come on, Peter.
Yes, exactly. We'll all be with that.
Would you go back into an executive job?
I really do believe I had the best job in the industry, by far. I had a phenomenal job. And, I was running the whole company for 13 years. I'd been there for 20 years. And I wanted to do something more personal.
Last question. There was a Japanese film called Afterlife, which has as its premise that if you go to the next life, you're allowed to take one memory with you. One memory from your experiences as producers that you would take with you, what would it be?
My one memory goes way back. During the week, I was at working title, and Chris had a day job too, and it was super low budget. We just it was $6,000. I mean, this was the first feature we'd made. We'd made student films, and we'd actually, I say it was our first feature. We had actually done a sort of abortive attempt at a feature that really was no good. And plus we were in it, which was never good. So that
both of you and Chris.
Yes, terrible.
How do we see that?
Yes.
It's locked away. But this was the first sort of proper film that we'd made, and we moved to LA. We managed to get it into the San Francisco Film Festival, and we had to raise money for a print, which Eric and Tim very kindly helped with. We had to raise this other $6,000 for the print, and we had the print made in London at Metrocolor, and it was a black and white film. It was very difficult to get them to put it in the bath, and we had this very clear date when we needed to screen it. They did it. Our lead actor brought it out to San Francisco for this first public screening. And the first time we ever watched that print, and it's actually crazy to me now when I look back, that the idea that the first time we watched that print was in the cinema with the audience. Since then, we've had some great screenings, but I think I will never forget that screening, which was so much hard work to get to, and it went great.
Oh.
I think mine is similar to Emma's, is being at Sundance and the whole sensation and the vibe of everybody around you and their breath and just, feeling that. And in that last moment when Mason gets in his car.
Don't tell everybody the end of the film.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Sorry.
I think we all have seen it.
No,
Yeah.
we have a whole audience.
There's a lot of other people.
There's this final really heartfelt moment, and for me personally, because I'd been raising my daughter while working on the film, and that was when I finally really felt what it was saying, just as an audience member, and and then the tears came, and I'm sitting there crying. I think that being able to have achieved something that I even fooled myself into just being an audience member in is that, that Rick had that profound effect on me. That was really...
Yeah, that's very hard to do.
That was a beautiful moment.
John, one memory that's not a screening that lives with you.
I remember meeting Paul Thomas Anderson for the first time with his dog outside my office. I remember I was working with this young filmmaker who had never made a movie before, David O. Russell, and he came over to my house. My girlfriend at the time made dinner for us all, and halfway through dinner, we couldn't find David, and he was tucked away in bed, just sleeping in our bed.
That sounds like David.
I don't know. I mean, there's so many great memories.
Mark?
I took a sort of a side path from the film business for a couple years because I had this thought upon reading this book that was supposed to be a movie turned into a stage musical, which is called Wicked. And so the first time that a group of actors sat in a room and read the whole piece and sung it. It was 3 hours long, no scenery, nothing, and the emotional experience that was felt in that room was so beyond anything I'd ever thought when I thought it was a good idea. That feeling is something I've always held on to. And
are we going to see a Wicked movie?
We are indeed.
When?
Soon, in the next several years.
But have you held it in the theatre without going to the movie because it's been so successful, or do you really
For
want...
a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
One is we've been fortunate enough to be very successful. And I think, honestly, to be very honest, the bar is so high, at least for me personally, to make sure that what is done is, as a film, stands alone as a cinematic experience different from the theater. And that's not easy.
Eric, one memory.
Well, mine was a pre-screening one. Can I have that? It was my first film called Sid and Nancy, and I'd just come out of the music business, and I made this film about punk rock, and it was right where my sensibilities were. And it got selected for Directors' Fortnight in Cannes. So we all went down to Cannes, and it was screening in the Old Palais. And about 500 punks came down from Paris for the screening. And they rioted, and they smashed all the windows and the doors at the front of the Palais. And it was just, I just looked at this and I thought, I love the film business. This is where I want to be. There's tear gas going off. And so that was when I thought, that's when I was hooked.
Peter?
I was on the set, so it's not a screening thing, with Ridley shooting Exodus. And we were in the Canary Islands, in this godforsaken place, but we had 3,000 extras, 200 horses, 50 chariots, and the two things I remember really well, first of all, Ridley is one of the most moving people I've ever met because he's so damn passionate. You look at the breadth of his career, but he's there, Ridley's in his mid-70s, and he's just charging. You know, we made that movie in 73 days, and he's whipping everybody along and just trying to get where you've got Christian and Joel. And then I remember this one image of, we had all these extras, it was a cold day, they were all in costume, but they're all wearing parkas and smoking cigarettes over costume. So you have thousands of extras in Egyptian costumes smoking, and I just felt like, look, I've been around the movie business a long time. I've never seen something of that scale and that spectacle. And I don't think there's anyone in the world other than Ridley who could really handle that today. And he's got 5 3D cameras going, and he's barking orders, and he's just more alive than anyone I've ever seen in those moments. He's a remarkable man and really deeply inspirational. I think in sort of the theme of what we've all been talking about, which is wanting to make stuff. And he just, and Ridley goes nuts sort of 3 weeks after the movie's over because he's like, I gotta get going, I gotta start the next one. I think he starts his next movie in 2 weeks.
He doesn't idle well.
Yeah.
John Lesher, Cathleen Sutherland, Peter Chernin, Eric Fellner, Marc Platt, Emma Thomas, thank you very much for taking part in the Hollywood Reporter Roundtables, the producers. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.